Well, thank you so much, Sol, for the introduction, and thank you so much for staying with us. And we'll do our very best to put some energy in the room and make sure you feel like the best was saved for last, so to speak. We're very happy to talk today a little bit about the Middle Eastern art market. I think the title is already inherently a little bit problematic because it comes, first of all, with this geographic denominator, Middle East, and many of us who have very strong connections in the region or those who work in the region don't often quite know what that actually means. It goes, on the other hand, as a very handy I think categorization when it comes to the market or when it comes to aggregating certain areas to simply talk about something as if it was a monolith. So there was maybe a boom in Chinese art maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and then came the Middle Eastern art, and there were all these sort of waves. But really, the Middle East is a very, very complex, complicated region, and in as much as we're talking about the Middle East, I would like to very cautiously actually mention that we are specifically talking about two very specific models in Dubai, and May, who is based in Cairo, also works a bit more across the region, and I believe Cairo is actually technically not really the Middle East, or is it the Middle East? It's definitely Africa, so you could have also spoken...
Definitely Africa and the Middle East.
And the Middle East, so it's a bit of everything. And anyway, but without much further ado, I would just like to introduce a little bit how we're going to tell you a little bit about the region and the market that we've all been part of for many, many years. And in fact, many of us have worked together over the last 10 years, really, on many different projects. So first of all, we have with us here Sunny Rahbar, she's the founder and also director of Third Line Gallery. The gallery is founded by her and Claudia Cellini in Dubai in 2005. So this was really very, very early. It's actually 15 years.
Yeah.
That was at a time when people didn't really think of Dubai and art in one sentence or in the same context. That was even before there was an art fair, so you were really a true pioneer, and we really look forward to hearing a little bit about that from you later and how the gallery evolved and how your view of the whole market is.
Thank you.
Secondly, we have with us Eldib. She joined Sotheby's in 2008, and she's become a very close friend because besides being a very successful person in the auction world and in securing especially modern Arab art, she's also very connected to the whole collector scene, and she helped us enormously in putting together our exhibition on surrealism in Egypt and opening many doors and helping us actually find the material which is often very, very hidden. So I think in this particular case, it would be wonderful if you later on tell us a bit more about your role and maybe talk a bit more about the modern art aspect of the Middle Eastern art market, quote unquote. And finally, we have with us Vilma Jurkute, who is the director of Alserkal. You joined the organization in 2011. Alserkal is a very interesting model, I would say, which is quite unique anywhere, but it's also very specific to Dubai. It is a creative district or area. It's quite hard. I think you'll tell us more a little bit of how you would like to name it, but it is really a creative hub and a creative hotspot in the city of Dubai. It expanded quite massively in 2017. This is now the area where pretty much most of the galleries are housed in Dubai, but also many other creative companies and different organizations, some cool eateries, a very great, amazing cinema as well, Cinema Agil. And it's really one of the places to be. And finally, in 2019, under Vilma's directorship, there was a formation of a non-profit foundation as well, which is supporting all the non-profit activities that Alserkal is actually doing. So that's a very eclectic model, and we look forward to hearing from you a little bit about how basically an institution plays a role in a city that is maybe not characterized by very traditional museums and traditional institutions as we know them in many European cities. Okay, so thank you so much, and I would like to first ask Claudia to, Sunny.
It's okay. I can leave.
We've only known each other for 12 years, so to tell us a little bit about the story of Third Line Gallery and highlight some aspects of what you've been doing.
Well, we have a little presentation. Oh, it's there. Okay, great. So thank you, Till, for the introduction, and to my panelists and to Talking Galleries. This is a wonderful event, and it's really great to be here and hear all of the ideas. And I'm happy that we're sort of at the end, because I felt like I had to change my presentation a few times to kind of fit. But I'll just try to be brief and tell the story or sort of a brief history of the Third Line and how we started and why. So to explain, I'm from Iran, but I grew up in Dubai. My parents moved to Dubai in 1980. I was 3. And the idea was to go back to Iran. That never happened, so we ended up staying in Dubai. As a result, I grew up there. And that time, if you grew up in Dubai, to go away, if you wanted to go to university, you'd have to go away. So I ended up leaving when I was 16. I went to London first, then I went to New York, and we basically. Sorry, not we. I basically, I had discovered that I wanted to work in the arts, and I ended up in New York going to an art school, and started. That was how I started. And when I graduated, after doing a few stints, different places, I was at an internship at the Guggenheim. I worked in London at Sotheby's on a sale. I worked at an artist-run space. I did a lot of things. I wasn't sure exactly where I wanted to be in the art world, but I knew I wanted to. So I was a little bit reluctant to move back to Dubai when I graduated, because I thought, well, what am I going to do in Dubai? There's not really an art scene. There wasn't really, any galleries, or institutions or anything. So, when my mother called me and said, "You've got to come back," I was like, "No, I'm not coming back. I'm going to stay." And then eventually I kind of had to go back, because 9/11 had happened. I was in New York. It was 2001. And it was a real moment where it was actually, safer to be in the Middle East somehow. So I had just finished working. I had worked with iStorm. I don't know if you remember iStorm. It was an online platform for art, and they'd opened a physical space. And I was part of the team that went out there to set that up. And they were an interesting model, and I think that's kind of coming back, but that's another story. But anyway, so I had finished working with them, and I get this call from my mom being like, "You got to come back." So I was like, okay, fine. So 2001, I go back to Dubai, realize there's an opportunity, because Dubai is now booming, and within the region, Dubai was really an island of sort of peace, and there was stability, and there was an airport, and you could get in and out, and things were. It was the beginning of the let's say the boom. So at that time, I started to look around and see what I could do. I was interested in the artists that were from the region, because I was from the region, and from my time in London and New York, and I was also in Paris for a year, I realized that there was very little representation, or not at all, no representation of Middle Eastern artists, and I was wondering why. So I started to meet artists here and there before I had left, and I decided when I came back to Dubai that this would be sort of my life's mission to create somehow. I didn't know what it was going to be, but to create a platform, a space where artists from the Middle East can be represented, and so the world can come to know of them. And so that was sort of the beginning. At the time, I started to do some shows independently, where I was curating different spaces, anything I could find, literally. I mean, hotel lobbies, warehouses, shops, anything, and whoever I could find to sponsor it. And I was working with artists that I knew, and some that were living in Dubai at the time, and really began. That was sort of the beginning. In 2005, I met Claudia Cellini, my business partner, and Omar Ghabash, and we had a conversation, and Claudia said, "Well, what would you do if you could do anything in Dubai?" And I said, "Well, this moving around and doing shows here and there is a little bit difficult, and nobody's really buying art. But I would I don't know, I'd maybe get a space and do something in the space." And she's like a gallery, and I said, "Well, I don't know. I mean, just a space where it just be a permanent space where we could do shows, we could really, expand." And she said, "Well, why don't we do this together?" And I was like, she's mad. But I liked that, because I was like, oh, it is a possibility, because there was really nothing happening. There were people buying art, but they were buying art when they were leaving Dubai, and they were going to, the other, art centers like London, New York, and they would buy Western art, but also maybe Orientalist art. There wasn't really, so it was really this for me, this was the moment that it all sort of, in terms of the contemporary art. I mean, there were artists making, there were modern Arab artists, Iranian artists, and the traditional centers of the art world in the Middle East were Beirut, Damascus, Cairo, Tehran, and these places were at this moment, and sadly still today, not accessible places. So Dubai seemed like the perfect place to actually do this. So this was 2005. We opened. We managed to get some money together, and we didn't have that much. So we wanted to get the biggest space for the least amount of rent, and so we opened in the industrial district of Dubai, which is called Al Quoz, which is where we still are and where Alserkal is. This was our first space. It was a warehouse, and we clad the front, and it was great. We started. This is a great picture from the side where you see the ACs. Anyway, this was the first space, and we went about. I wasn't only interested in working with artists that were from the Middle East, living in the Middle East. I was interested in working with artists that were from the Middle East, living also in the diaspora. So that was the sort of the focus of the program. The reason being, I was interested to see, in 100 years from now, what happened and what, and what's. And I'm still curious. I probably won't be alive then, but I'm curious to see. And so much has changed in these 15 years. So we turned 15 actually in April, and I can't believe it. Like this feels like a long time ago, and it was only 2015. So we started to do shows. This is we had one small project space upstairs and a larger space downstairs. This is Abbas Akaban. We realized very quickly that we couldn't just do shows and sell art because people didn't necessarily, there wasn't a buying public, there wasn't an audience. So we had to start to, we had to do other things. So we basically we were very, very active. It was a dynamic space. We had a lot of programming. We did artist talks. We showed films, mostly centered around the Arab world. We had a book club reading books by Arab writers in English and in Arabic, and then we get together and talk about what's lost in translation. So we were really trying to cultivate. In a way, we were acting somehow like an institution because there was no institutions at the time. There were no museums. There was no foundations. There was really it was really a sort of quiet but really busy moment for us. Mm-hmm. And so we started to meet artists. Here and there, we met other artists through artists that we knew. This is Sahand Hesamian. He's an Iranian sculptor based in Tehran. This was one of our last shows in this space. This is Ala Ebtekar. He's an Iranian artist based in San Francisco. He's sort of a second generation Iranian American. And so, this is Joanna Hajitoma and Khalil Jurej, Lebanese husband and wife, filmmakers. And we represent them, their practice as artists, and they're based between Beirut and Paris. So, as you can see, slowly the program was developing. Now we have 27 artists that we represent, and that was the other thing that we were doing. We were representing artists, where a lot of, that sort of didn't exist. There was and that was modeled on the Western model, or what I had learned from my time away. But really, I also realized very quickly that model doesn't necessarily fit within the geographic context that we were in. So, we had to sort of make up a few things as we went along. Sorry, I'm just going back to my notes, make sure I didn't miss anything. But basically, as we continue to build the program and, cultivate the audiences, we started to actually sell art, which was great because we were a commercial gallery and we wanted to be a nonprofit, but we couldn't because there's no way of being a nonprofit in Dubai at that time. I don't think there is still a possibility. Now there is. Oh, now there is. Okay. Too late.
Hence
okay.
the foundation.
Okay, the foundation.
Since last year.
Yeah. So anyway, so we basically had to become a commercial gallery. And it was funny because even at the time, there was no license for a commercial gallery in Dubai. Now there is. So a lot has changed. There was no real infrastructure. I mean, we couldn't find framers. I mean, there were so many things that, it was really like everything we did, we had to really, there were framers, but they were not framing, art, and they didn't know how to handle art. There was no shippers. There was no art handlers. I mean, it was really just, we did a lot at that point. then 2007. So now we're sort of at the height of the boom in Dubai. I mean, everything sort of exploded. It was just like everyone was in Dubai. It was like a gold tower boom, whatever, gold rush. And people were looking at Dubai, and people were coming, and people were investing in real estate and all the things that you could do. And the auction houses quickly realized that there is something to do. And so they started to enter into the market as well. And there was a few auctions that Christie's and Sotheby's had started to do around contemporary and...
So our first sale was in 2007
Yeah.
in London, and it was a modern and contemporary Arab and Iranian Turkish sale.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
And
Yes.
Christie's had done it also in Dubai.
In Dubai. Okay. Yeah. So then, then suddenly people are like, oh, you can buy art, you can sell art. You can. So suddenly everyone was like, wait. So this was this real moment that crystallized everything. Because then in that same year, the Gulf Art Fair started, which was now it's called Art Dubai, but it was the beginnings of the sort of real market developing. So, sorry, I have pictures of that. Sorry, this is Farhad Moshiri. This is also in our old space. We used to, this was Hassan Hajjaj's show. We used to do a lot in that old space. We always had people around. This was a Ganawa musician that did a live performance. We did dinners. Oh, wait, how come my other slides are not here? Okay, I had some Gulf Art Fair slides, but maybe they're coming up later. So basically, this was 2007. I'd say like everything sort of started. The fair started. The Christie's, Sotheby's. People were like buying art, and it was like this mad frenzy. It was really intense because we'd gone from not selling art, but just trying to kind of stay in business, but also relevant. But also now it was just like everyone was like, "What do you have?" And I think this was the time where also, some of our artists started to get recognized.
Poached?
Not yet. Not poached yet. We get there. But the market was sort of, it was really crazy. And one of our artists, Farhad Moshiri, who you saw here, went for literally overnight. One of his pieces sold at an auction in Dubai for $1 million, and I was selling him in the gallery for... At the time, I think the most expensive piece I had was like $20,000, and that was like the end. So it was like, oh, okay, that just happened. So it was really a scary moment as well, because I feel like suddenly like this market developed without much, and there still wasn't much else going. There was a few other galleries that had opened, and the galleries that opened near us, so that suddenly like Alco's, this industrial district, became the this sort of Chelsea or whatever, or the Soho of Dubai. And that's when Alserkal comes in, because Alserkal had these spaces right opposite where we were, and they were renting them to galleries that came in. So eventually all the galleries were in Alserkal, and we were just across the street. So, and then we decided we don't want to be by ourselves. So 2016, we moved to Alserkal Avenue. This is our new space from the outside. This was our first show. Monir Farman-Farmayon, who was an artist that just passed away last year in April. She was 96 when she passed away, and she was an artist that I discovered her when she was 81, and I discovered her through a colleague and friend, Rose Issa, who was working with her in London. And she's gone on to do very well and to be very known, and she had many exhibitions in museums, and that was also an interesting time, because I think what happened when the art fair started, they started to bring out quite a lot of curators and art journalists, and so people like yourselves were coming, and then these people were also seeking out what was happening, like who are the artists, who are the Arab artists, and the Iranian artists, and Monir was someone that was discovered in that way. Hans Ulrich Obrist discovered her work on one of his visits, and then interviewed her in Dubai at the art fair, and that started the journey of Monir, and which was really basically a rediscovery of her, because she was always an artist, but had gone through a period where she, moving between Iran and New York and family, she had sort of been forgotten. So that was the story of Monir.
Great.
I don't know. I mean, I can go on, but am I up my 12 minutes?
No, I can also ask you some questions.
Yeah, maybe you can ask me questions, because I have not ever. I mean, So then when we moved, so now as you can see, we also moved into a bigger space. We were 10 years old when we moved in, and we wanted to we wanted to expand, and I think we did. Like, the space is much bigger. Some of my artists don't like it, and we have, we also responded to the things that we needed now. So we have, an upstairs space, an AV room. We've just opened a small shop as well. We're not quite as big as this is the upstairs space, Gallery 2. But this is Sofia Almaria, a Qatari American artist that we work with, Rana Begum. Fouad El-Khouri, a very important Lebanese photographer based between Beirut and Paris, is one of Yusuf Nabil, Slavs and Tatars. I'm just showing you some of our artists. So we also continued in the new space. We continued with our programming. I mean, now Dubai is a very different place. There's independent cinemas. There's many more galleries. There's foundations. There are a few institutions. But we still, we sort of stayed focused to sort of our ethos, which is to still do these kinds of things. Every time an artist is in town, we'll do artist talks. We'll host events, opportunities for people to meet the artists, but also for collectors to come together. And this is the Gulf Art Fair. So that was the Gulf Art Fair.
I remember that.
Yeah, do you remember it?
Yeah.
And then this is Art Dubai. So yeah, so another thing that happened in 2008, so we quickly realized that being in Dubai was not enough because the region was not, the market was growing, but it was not big enough. And also, we wanted our artists to be known outside of the Middle East. So we realized that art fairs would be the way to go forward. So we started to apply to fairs, and our strategy was that we would only do the best or the top fairs because, well, if we're going to do it, we might as well just, go big or go home. So we kept applying. We always get rejected. Eventually, because also a lot of people didn't understand what we were doing. They're like Middle Eastern art, Arab art, who, what, it was still, in the Middle East, people were coming around, but in the Western world, people were still not, kind of sure what to think of it. So when we got into Frieze, that was 2008, that was Frieze London. That was like a real moment. And we went with Farhad Moshiri, our Iranian artist. We had 4 paintings. And we had no idea what was going to happen. We didn't know if we were going to, people were going to understand or not. But we thought for Farhad's the most known artist. So we went with Farhad, and it was very successful. We've continued to we do Frieze London, with New York. This is our Basel when we get in. We do Basel, Hong Kong as well, and we do Basel when we get in. This was last year. We did get in Farah Al-Qasimi, a young Emirati artist that we work with. And this is the shop. We call it the library, but it's a shop, and you can come and we do a print series, limited edition prints, books, magazines. We publish books on our artists. So this is some of the publications we've done. This is some of the prints. This is we also work with furniture designers and other designers, also from the Middle East. We're trying to sort of, we're not just doing visual arts. We're also trying to show what else there is in the region. So I'll get to that later. Okay.
Super, thank you so much. That was really interesting.
I was going on. I was like 12 minutes.
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, since we're sitting here also in a conference that is looking a little bit at the market behind all the in this case the Middle Eastern region. So perhaps basing a little bit on what you were saying, that you felt the UAE was not enough, it wasn't big enough, and you felt there was a need to do art fairs. Can you maybe tell the audience a little bit about where your collectors are from, where they are based,
well, when we started, the
who is buying, and so on? Yeah,
when we first started, obviously all of our collectors were in the region because we were only in the region. We didn't do fairs. We didn't do that. I mean, social media was just before Instagram. We had Facebook. I mean, but it was. So people would come to Dubai, and there were these opportune moments during, but there wasn't much. So our collectors were mostly from the region. So we found that Iranian collectors would buy Iranian art, Arab collectors would buy Arab art. It was like there was this thing that was happening. We also then had collectors that were in the diaspora. So they were like, again, Arab, Middle Eastern collectors who lived in London. Mostly Europe, I would say, at the beginning. And I would say at that point it was probably like 80% maybe even 90% locally or regionally based. Saudi, Iran. We had collectors in Bahrain, Qatar. Yeah. And then Lebanon. And then when we started to do the fairs and we started to go out some more, we had more collectors from Europe mostly, and then America. And now it's quite the opposite. Now most of our collectors are actually outside of the region, which is an interesting moment as well. We can talk about that, but not to say that there are no collectors, and there are. But it's also it depends on the artists. Some of our more established artists are being, shown outside of the region, so therefore they have collectors outside of the region, which is what we also wanted, not for them just to sell outside, but also to have platforms to show outside. Yeah.
Another question for you is, you have quite an interesting roster of artists, and we know personally a lot of them, and we've worked with you with many of your artists actually. And what I find quite interesting is that some artists that you represent, like Joanna Khalil, for example, actually had a presence internationally in France. They're mostly based in Paris, as you said, but they have an international gallery in France, for example.
Right.
And then, in a sense, you reconnected them to the region, in a sense, right? Because you became their representative in Dubai and in the region. And so can you maybe tell us a little bit about, does an artist have to be based internationally, a Middle Eastern artist, to be successful? Can they be based in the region? Can they be based in Dubai? Or how do you see this?
I think it's important. I mean, when we first opened, there was a little bit of, interestingly, there was a little bit of backlash from our own community, or I'd say from the region. Like, people would be like, "Oh, you're pigeonholing artists by geography, or by having a Middle Eastern art gallery." And I said, "Well, okay. I'm also just responding to a particular moment in time. Our program now is expanding as we speak, and I'll talk about that later. But at that moment, that was necessary. And you're right. A lot of the artists that were not based, that already, like for example, Yusuf Nabil, an Egyptian artist, was based in Paris, between Paris and New York. And he had people that knew his work, they were buying his work. But he didn't have anyone in the Middle East representing him, because there was no one. There was no one. So yeah, you're right. A lot of those artists, Joanna and Khalil, they were finally being able to come back home, or closer to home. There in Beirut there was, and there still is, Fair Semler Gallery, but she also opened around about the same time we opened, and she was originally still is in Germany, but opened this other space. So there was this interesting moment where artists were also like, "Oh, I'm coming back," and because it wasn't just the audiences in the West that was looking at their work; it was also the audiences back home that didn't know, and that was what I felt. I felt that, we don't even know who our artists are, so how can we possibly, what's gone wrong, And there was this moment, like I said, this, the modern, the modernists and 50s, 60s, 70s, and then there was nothing. And then there was just, but then there were artists, because people had gone to art schools and had left, or had gone because of whatever, revolutions, wars, had left to study abroad, and then never went back. But then they were kind of lost in the West and not known in the East. And so I think we responded to really that. But yeah.
Well, I think that's a great transition actually to our next panelist. I think there's nothing wrong with having a focus. I think this word pigeonholing, I find it a bit silly sometimes, because I think you need to have a clear profile as a gallery also. And I think it is also quite necessary. And as much as when you say, I think you have Middle Eastern artists, whatever that means, Abbas is Canadian. Joanna Khalil are French at the end of the day. So it also depends on what you mean.
And you're Finnish.
How they're born. And I'm Finnish apparently, which I just found out. So
I thought he was Finnish.
So that's really quite interesting. I think when it comes to that, because I think really when you talk about an artist and you sort of lump them by ethnicity or something like that, does not at all actually explain their cultural background or origin. Because they could live, can be second, third generation, having born
and I think
in
that's
France
what
or something.
I was a little bit disappointed by that, because I was like, well, I'm Iranian. I was born in
Correct.
America. I grew up
And
in
you don't
Dubai.
speak Arabic, and,
I understand
was
Arabic,
right.
but I should speak Arabic, but I speak better French. But the thing is, I said, you know what? It doesn't matter. Like,
Yeah,
it's not
exactly.
about sort of, but like I remember it was at Homeworks, which is a great forum that takes place in Beirut, which is a super intellectual forum, and everyone comes and like, you know, share. It's much like this, but and there I felt like people were like, oh, that's the third line. I mean, it was those early days, and I was like,
Yes.
meanwhile, those same artists wanted representation in the West, and this was a way that they were able to do so. So it was an interesting moment. I felt kind of, oh, we're doing this for you, but then maybe, but yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think they just
It's
wanted to
so
be known. I think they just wanted to be known as artists, not
Correct.
an Arab artist or an Iranian artist. And I agree with that. They are just artists, and we weren't saying you should like this because this is an Iranian artist. No, but you know, yeah, it just happened that we were in the Middle East.
And we don't even have to go into the complexities of the diversity of the cities and the cultures and whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, the other thing I think that is really important, and this leads me now to May a little bit, is that I think in Dubai, and I was also there in 2007 when the Gulf Fair opened up. I was running a museum in New York at the time, and we wanted to actually build a bridge. And I can remember this sort of sense of gold rush and trying to find partners and building up programs and all those kind of things. Yeah, that's where we met, actually, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the problem with that was very quickly that I think everybody thought, oh my God, all of a sudden there is art in the Middle East. You know, the story was very seductive of, you know, having the desert and having the fantasy of the camels, and then there's like art, you know, and it sort of doesn't go together. And how do we go about it? So they got an enormous amount of international press coverage, and I think there was an incredible amount of international collectors and people that were so curious about that new kid on the block, in a sense. But I think it also overshadowed a little bit the fact that, you know, there has been art all over, and that just also goes for the UAE in particular. I mean, the pavilion we did in Venice was an artist this year who had been around for a long, long time. You know, she's mostly a poet, and so there's been a cultural production for a very long time, even before there was an art fair, that perhaps took a little bit the attention away and puts the Middle East perhaps on the global art tourism map, but other than that, there has been artistic production all along, and I think May, your passion is a little bit modern art, because it's a lot. I mean, there has always been art, basically, and not just in Dubai. I think Dubai is, if anything, a bit the latecomer compared to other cities, and I think you being from Egypt and Alexandria,
I think
Cairo is a hotspot for that.
Yeah, I think everyone sort of, like you say, tends to forget that the Middle East has been producing art ever since,
like anywhere else in the world, really.
I mean, if we talk about specifically like art and architecture and everything, Middle East has been producing art since BC, the time of BC. But some people forget that in the 19th century, a lot of Middle Eastern artists were actually also producing art, and the early 20th century. And actually, that's sort of our focus in the modern and contemporary Arab and Iranian sales at Sotheby's, is that we focus a lot on these forgotten modernists and these lost modernists. And if we can pull up my slideshow.
I think that's not
right here. So, for example, like when we were talking, we started our auctions in 2007 in London, and we sort of had a lapse, and we relaunched again in London in 2016. And London has been serving as the key platform for us in terms of sales, because London is London. London is London. It's one of the biggest art cities in the world, but also it's neutral. It's a very neutral city, and you can't compete. You don't have this friendly rivalry between other countries. So it's a great position to be in. And we host 2 auctions a year, one in October and one in April. And our focus again is definitely on modernists. And I remember when there was a discussion this morning about contemporary artists not being included in the sale if they're not like been painted 10 years or whatnot. We usually aim to never include something that's super contemporary, because there are, as we said, a lot of forgotten modernists. And for example, Fakhrennisa Zaid, who is a Turkish artist, but she's not only Turkish, she is the encapsulation of an Ottoman artist, because she was born in Turkey, married to an Iraqi royal, and then lived in exile in Jordan. So would you consider her, in fact, she belongs to all 3 countries. And we were very lucky to include this wonderful piece by Fakhrennisa Zaid called Towards the Sky, which was actually in an American corporate collection in the Midwest, and it was sort of lost and forgotten there. And this is one of the things that we love to do as a sale, is to find these lost treasures and to bring them back home. And this sold for a record of 1.3 million. But actually, it unlike a lot of the modernists that we end up selling, this found a Western collector who was very keen on it and ended up getting it. So sometimes you get these like lovely surprises. And I don't know if I'm switching. Yeah. So basically, yes, we started in 2007 and relaunched again in 2016 in London. But most of our lots that we're trying to sell, and 77% of the value is definitely in the modern art. And just, I know our numbers in the general, in the general contemporary stream don't seem that large, but we don't have, and Sunny can speak to that as well, we don't have the $1 million artists. We don't have a lot of these $1 million artists. We have a lot of sweet spot artists, which are like the 100,000, the 200,000, with the capacity to grow if they're given a more institutional focus and more of a push from the museum community. And I think that's one of the gaps that we're seeing that is starting to be filled right now in the UAE, in the art market, and in the ecosystem in the UAE through the museums that are being built, whether it be Louvre, Abu Dhabi, whether it be Guggenheim, which is so necessary to highlight these sort of forgotten modernists. And for example, in the background, you can see a work by Mahmoud Sabri, who's also an Iraqi modernist, who ended up living in exile in Prague, and sort of he was educated in Moscow, and this one made 1.1 close to $1.2 million, which was a record for the artist. And it's always a delight to find these gems, which was also in London, not in the Middle East, and which is one of the things when you ask me, where are these modernist artworks? A lot of them are actually not in the Middle East, and a lot of them end up being in Europe because they were bought by early on Western collectors who saw these works and really liked them while they were living in the Middle East, and then brought them back to whether it be Germany or London or Paris, and then we ended up finding them and then consigning them, and they managed to find a way to go back home to the Middle East, which is also a wonderful story. So 60 to 65% is usually from the modernists, which is Iran, Egypt, and Iraq, which are the old and the historic sort of collecting countries and art producing countries, because Dubai, as Sunny said, was very late onto the scene.
It's also a very small city historically. I mean.
But it's very young. It's still not a production center.
Definitely. And this is just some of the statistics. This is the by distribution, by heat distribution. It's definitely, we're looking at, again, Egypt, Iraq, and Iran as the main art producing countries early on. And when we talk about the forgotten modernists, for us to like really push them, as with your show at the Centre Pompidou about the Egyptian surrealists, this usually really, you see a big translation for that for the artists in the auction market. So once they are even in a museum show in the West, it's a bigger stamp of approval, and you'll see their prices increase twofold or threefold. And we've seen that case with Inji Aflatun also, who's an Egyptian modernist, who was included at the Venice Biennale when it was curated by Okwi. And after that, you had a huge collecting base, which was non-Arab, because there's this recognition and there's this affinity that you can also recognize the artist.
Validation.
Exactly, it is validation. As much as it's something you struggle with, that it's like you need Western validation, but it's also important because it's very difficult for me to bring a catalog and tell you, know what, you should buy Inji Aflatun. She's the most important feminist artist in the Middle East, the only one that spent time in jail, blah, blah, blah. But if you can't connect with her, if you haven't seen her work, if she hasn't been to Venice, why should I buy her? Do you know what I mean? But it's also, it's the role. Yeah. We have to do this as well.
I mean, I think it's not just only the validation. I think that's certainly very important, and I think a lot of collectors seem to be gravitating more and more towards these kind of check marks or these kind of, token kind of labels, whatever, as a reassurance. But I think for especially a lot of these modernist artists is that you actually have a very hard time being able to see one. Like if I want to go out nowadays and I want to see a piece by Inji Aflatun, for example,
it's
or
very
by
hard to come
for a
across
Camel or someone like that, where do I go actually, right?
Museums?
I mean, which museum do you go to? In the Middle East, there is also a lack of institutions in the region, but internationally, in other museums, they're not collected. From the Surrealism show, what is super exciting to us is the Kunstsammlung Düsseldorf, I think, bought 3 of the star pieces from the show. They bought a wonderful piece by Mayo, the Greek Egyptian master, as well as for a Camel, and the third piece as well. By Tilmisani. So I think this is a really rare coincidence. Now they are hanging actually I think before the show, nobody knew there was surrealism in
Absolutely.
Egypt, that there was a very strong manifestation of that. And now these three pieces are hanging actually in the Kunstsammlung in Düsseldorf amongst all the other great surrealist artists in their collection. And not really to make an ethnic focus, but simply the story of surrealism, I would say, got completed. You know, also the Encyclopedia of Surrealism have asked us to contribute now in their new encyclopedia on surrealism. And I think that is also necessary, you know, that you actually complete the story in a sense, and that you're able to see them. So beyond the validation, I think it's also simply access in many cases.
It's definitely that. Like in the last, I was just in New York in July, and I was at the Metropolitan, and they had just bought a work by Abdelhadi Gazzar, who's probably one of the most important Egyptian modernists from the 50s.
Yes.
And it was hanging right there with the
At the Met.
At the Met. And Claire Davis, who's the current curator at the Met for the Middle East, she hung it right there amongst the modern masters, European modern masters, and it's not in communication or anything. It was just simply, it's part of the art history that is sort of forgotten from the Middle East, and it's something that we have to work hard at showcasing it.
Yes,
And I think the
it takes
auction
time.
platform, as much as a lot of people don't like the auction platform, it does really help because we have Sotheby's as a platform. We have you have access to everyone, and through our website, through our exhibition space in London, everyone's able to access and see those artworks, and it becomes more accessible than, for example, going to Cairo, Tehran, or Beirut. We're in London, we're showing these artists, and our catalog's going to everyone, and it's on the website. So it does really offer great marketing for these artists and a great platform. But besides that, something that we've done as a sale, and we've talked about this, is that we're trying as much as possible to create niche sections where we're trying to highlight these even more forgotten people, like the Armenian artists in diaspora. So the Middle East had a huge Armenian diaspora population in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Iran, and Tehran as well. And sort of to show the Armenian artists that were living there and producing there, and to do that as a section with an essay by an academic, and also to have them focused part of our exhibition. And this actually doesn't usually end up being very fruitful in terms of sales, but it's actually, we as a group and the Middle Eastern team, we really believe in it because we don't have these museums that will be able to showcase these amazing gems or say these stories which are so necessary in terms of Arab modernity and Iranian modernity.
And it doesn't come easy. I mean, the show in surrealism, I think it took us also 6 years to put together the pieces because thanks to you also, you know, who has known many of the people that own some of the pieces or were connected with the group, you simply had the trust, or they were family friends of your family also for many, many years. So there is a different kind of way of accessing it. What I really find very fascinating, though, is that I think the duty of the museums internationally is not so much to include pieces all over the world simply because we have to globalize. But what I find really fascinating about the K20 acquisition, for example, is that this group of artists was very active.
And international. They weren't only
That's
active.
what I'm saying. They're international. But in this case particular, the manifesto in 38 actually took a stance against the fascists in Germany and against the defamation of artists as degenerate. Actually, they took a very clear stance against them and were composed of refugees that actually were able to work freely in Cairo at that time. While in Europe, none of these works could have been shown. So I think the amazing thing about when you really dig a little bit into these connections is that they are much more interconnected, and that the story of what happened to these artists in Cairo at that time is also very strongly connected to what was happening to artists in Germany at the same time, who were in dialogue and who were in contact with each other, or those that were in exile. And I think this is where it becomes really, really interesting, and I think that's the gaps in the stories that we have to tell when we go a little bit back from the contemporary, maybe a step back, because what I think it can teach us that it actually makes you see connections and not really end up talking about a Middle Eastern artist as a Middle Eastern artist, because you see there's a long history of connections and stories that need to be told.
And in all honesty, like a lot of artists, the question is always asked as to if it's a Middle Eastern artist, do they shy away from nudity?
Clearly
do they
not.
No, obviously not. Voluptuous and very interesting. But we seem to forget that the Middle East is not what you see in CNN. We seem to forget that the Middle East isn't necessarily what is the byproduct of 1979 as a political situation, whether it be the Islamic Republic of Iran or the siege of Mecca, which was really the turning point in the Middle East and changed the image of the Middle East. Pre-79 Middle East was quite liberal, was quite different, and was quite secular, to say. So the art being produced pre-79 is completely different than the art being produced post-1980. And that's also a very interesting thing to see and to analyze. Yeah. And I think a lot of us, because of the lack of like dissemination of textbooks on there's actually, like, quite sadly, there's no course on Middle Eastern art history, nor is there a textbook on Middle Eastern art history. And Middle Eastern art started, like, the first program started in 1907. So it's a very rich and in-depth artistic history, like, sorry for lack of a better word, but which we haven't been looking at. And right now all the focus is on contemporary artists versus the modernists, who are actually...
But I think the contemporary, what happened was that the contemporary art, when that started to pick up and people were like, oh, these are the artists, then there was an interest, an interest in what's well, who are the other artists who came before them. Yeah,
absolutely.
So actually, I think they both help each other.
It went in tandem. So and those are just some examples of the artists that we've sold, and we've sold very well. And I've just taken some of an Iranian modern master, and an Iraqi modern master, and an Egyptian modern master. And this is Bahman Muhassis, who ended up also living in exile in Italy. The Minotaur Scares the Good People, which is from 66, pre-79, everything. So in all honesty, it's not the easiest of markets, for sure. It does have, like any market, like as we were discussing, there are peaks and there are down points, but it's definitely worth it to discover these gems and to either bring them back home from collectors that were in Europe and have them go back home to, like, an Iranian collector in Dubai or an Iranian collector in LA, or it's also worth having a museum like the Met, which bought the Ghazal from auction. It's always interesting to see these things.
Oh, fantastic. Great, thank you so much. I think we can maybe now move on to Vilma. What I think is very interesting now to pick up a little bit.
I have anything left to add?
Oh yeah, there were a lot of things. I'm sure we'll get it out of you. I think what would be great is to build a little bit on what Sania was saying earlier on. You know, she was there before there was even Alserkal, and before, you know, this creative hub happened, before there was Art Dubai. But I think what is really also very important is to talk about the role of institutions in this whole you know, market, if you want to call it that. But it would be great if you can tell us a little bit about the role. You're a bit of a hybrid, commercial, non-commercial. If you can tell us a little bit about that model and the impact that you see it's having in Dubai on the society and perhaps also on the market as well.
So good evening, everyone. Last presentation. Stay with us. I think we're just slowly just getting it, just as we speak. I think it's interesting, the kind of introductions that you're already given, and perhaps it makes my role much easier as we try to. Let me just start. Yeah. So initially, I had a different kind of slide to start with, but yesterday I was taking a walk, and I saw this, and I thought, if I asked you, you know, what do you think? What kind of image comes to you when you think of Dubai? Perhaps you all would have different kind of perceptions as to what that city is. And I guess I would like to invite you on a more in-depth journey and perhaps try to understand that each city has those complexities and social structures that sometimes we kind of shy away from because of this reductive regionalism, or that particular place is meant to be something. And I think my colleagues here touched upon some of those aspects. And when Alserkal Avenue began, I mean, this is Dubai, this is our Dubai in ways. And I think when Alserkal Avenue began, the West didn't really know what to do with us. We didn't tick any of the traditional boxes. We are a neighborhood, we are a curated community that represents Middle Eastern art market, but also creative economy for the city. We are content producer, and we give back through Alserkal Arts Foundation. So what does that make us? And I think this is just to contextualize this role as a neighborhood. But I think we always, it was important to us to not view us within the physical space. Although predominantly housing 90 businesses, 90 galleries, but a community of thought leaders in literature, film, theater, all these mediums where they were able to challenge the conventional by being homegrown and local businesses and organizations. And I think that's really important to note, because sometimes we think of Dubai as everything being imported. And I think as a content producer, we stage exhibitions. We work with partners like Hayward Gallery in London, like Victoria and Albert Museum. But we also work with Samdani Arts Foundation from Dhaka in Bangladesh. We also work with Atasi Foundation in Syria. And I still remember when we inaugurated the very first project by Rem Koolhaas, OMA in the UAE, what became our exhibition space, and there were no museums at the time, or the Louvre was just about to open. A journalist asked me, why didn't you open an international show? We inaugurated the space with a show called Syrian to the Light, which was in collaboration with Atasi Foundation, and my answer was, what makes Syria not international? And I think there's a lot of that kind of aspect as to how we can challenge those perceptions through our programs, but also through experiences. I think Joe and colleagues in yesterday's panel, and quite a few of us kept referring to it as to how you connect with your local audiences, how you grow them, and the kind of experiences that you stage. As a content producer, as a co-producer, it's important that we engage our audiences locally, our audiences internationally, our audiences virtually through music, alternative contemporary dance. I remember then we started some of those programs that were quite rigorous and complex, and 7 people would show up. And that didn't discourage us. I think it's so important that as institutions, we actually continue to stage this kind of programming, because you educate your audiences organically and you grow that interest and curiosity. And today we do have art house cinema that is now a business, although 7 years ago it was 7 people, right? And the same as with contemporary dance performances. Perhaps the same would be with some of our just kind of not moving. I'm trying to get to here we are. And the same would be with our exhibitions program. And I think Sanya already also touched upon the importance of educating your own marketplace. And I think a lot of that burden fell on commercial galleries. And to be a business while you're developing an entire infrastructure in parallel is quite challenging, especially for a young gallery model. And these are our audiences today. We started with a few thousand. We are now more than 600,000 visitors annually that engages with multiple diasporas. I think in Dubai's context, we are a place that houses 200 nationalities. So then someone was referring to diversity. That's our daily routine. How do we connect to these diasporas? How do you serve many publics? Because that's how we think about our programs. And certainly our population is young. We don't have this conversation about, okay, boomer, because our median age is 33 years old. So, it's only millennials and Generation Z. And so for us, that's not even, we don't have much of unlearning to do. I think we had to right away think of a new model for our context. And so I think certainly as some of the functions that we also had to reimagine what is the role of a district or a community or someone who is the content producer is how do we help build this commercial infrastructure. And that's a collective effort. We are a conduit, a liaison point between public and private sectors. We work closely with the government, changing that legislation that would be adapted to facilitate those businesses better in arts and creative economies. But we also had to think of ways such as creating collector programs and collector trips and doing kind of taking that role of an art fair almost in our own context, or commissioning artists from our galleries, inviting them to do artist takeovers to reimagine our public realm was also important. And certainly we've done that with someone that I call art family. I mean, there were early visitors, is it Jill, is it Georgina Adams, who were curious from early stages as to what's happening here. And without that support, I mean, there was, I think, a change in the way the West views the Middle East. We are members of acquisition committees for the Middle East on, Tate Modern, Centre Pompidou, British Museum, etc. None of these acquisition committees for the Middle East or South Asia existed 7 years ago. Some are maybe just 10. And so I think the fact that these institutions said, hey, actually, it's worth archiving and collecting what's happening in this part of the world, it's important. I think there was that shift in thinking. And as Alserkal Arts Foundation, we certainly, what's important for us as a foundation, we are not a collecting foundation. We always worked with artists that are working in difficult conceptual mediums that are not maybe very commercial, and invite them to produce ephemeral work within the public realm of Alserkal or the city or internationally. And essentially, I think that kind of challenging the conventional, inviting multidisciplinary practitioners transcend those borders of disciplines through research, residency programs, research grants, artistic production. And I think in the context of scholarship, it's so important that we are claiming this new position. We are going beyond post-colonial and decolonial studies. I think there is this new generation of thinkers that are really reimagining what our region is, or what do we have to say. And so we're not really seeking that validity or correctness. I think this Eurocentric view of, Chakrabarti was writing about it in the 90s, that we are still in that kind of waiting room of history. And I think the new generation of thinkers are saying, hey, we have nothing to do with it. We are just claiming a completely new role. And so I think us supporting those thinkers and producing new forms of knowledge is really the key mission of a foundation. And I think as I kind of close, it's important that I think Dubai as a conduit, as a space, as a city, allows for diverse voices to come together. And I remember then we hosted ACAO, which is Asian Contemporary Art Week, that's been taking place in New York for more than 5 years, founded by Lisa Ahmedi. And last year, for the first time, it took place in Dubai. And she said in her opening remarks, she's like, I feel like finally Asia is connecting back to itself. Some of the aspects that you, Sunny, mentioned while working with your artists. And Dubai allows for that. A lot of these artists couldn't get a visa to go to New York. Dubai is that platform that I think depoliticizes some of those aspects through its infrastructure. And so I think that was important for us as a foundation, as a space. But this kind of, we are this hybrid model. We are looking at economic, social, environmental aspects, and I think and they benefit each other. They have its own challenges. We had a lot to learn. We went through this journey of milestones, but I think you also just were forced to innovate. And I remember then we tried to actually commission a competitive landscape study. The consultant said, we can't find anyone that's exactly like you guys. But we are not alone. You know, Dhaka Art Summit, these kind of initiatives are, I think, challenging what we constitute as global. I mean, what does global even mean? How are we thinking about this definition? Because perhaps it's not until we allow those diverse voices and models that are emerging from other parts of the world to be treated at an equal measure.
Correct.
You know, I think that's the kind of conversation that perhaps, you know, even talking galleries are initiating by having these new platforms as part of their program. But that's important to maybe talk about.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Vilma. I wanted to build on that a little bit. I think what you were saying, I think for those of you who have not been in Dubai, I think one of the most striking things is actually when you get in from the airport, is that in my opinion, it's the only city in the world where you really can't feel like a foreigner, because everyone is a foreigner. You know, there's 90% of the population is not local, is not from the UAE. People come from literally all around the world with all kind of cultural backgrounds, with all kind of religious backgrounds, and somehow it's this weird place that was constructed from scratch. And I think the strength that lies in a city that, you know, no city is perfect. There's clearly no utopia, but I think it allows for some kind of creative experimentation. And I think what is much more getting the headlines, in my opinion, having been there for such a long time, is perhaps the Louvre Abu Dhabi, you know, which is an imported model and it has its own value, its own position. But I can tell you that there are plenty more institutions like Alserkal that are really not following a model, but that are really truly homegrown somehow and trying to figure out something. How can we actually engage with our community? I think,
Right.
Sunny, you're reading this very early on. And there is this sort of creative kind of thing that is happening. And I think it also goes very much what you were saying against this binary. You know, I mean, in a city where you have expatriates from all over the world living and working in Dubai, whether they are from the Philippines, whether they are from the Baltics like you, whether they are from the States or anywhere else, is this still really a Middle Eastern city per se? Or is it a global city? And I think many of us actually carry that in us, you know. I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. I'm not Middle Eastern, but I'm extremely familiar with the region. So am I still Western in that binary definition? And I think the art history and everything that has been done has to probably be retaught a little bit and rethought of in those terms. So I think going back a little bit to my opening remark on why I think the panel has a very problematic title, you know, the Middle Eastern art market, I hope that we gave you a little bit of a deconstruction of that as we were talking here. And with that remark, I would like to now open up to questions to our panelists or all of us, and yeah, hear back from you. Are you
Hello.
using the microphone? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really, really interesting panel and for shifting us a bit from the Western-centered discourses we had sometimes. And I just want to ask, what do you think are, or what were your efforts, you know, when you talked about that some fairs were not accepting you, or that the Middle Eastern art was still kind of unknown and it was a bit of a taboo. And then going back to this, what's been said that the Middle East is not what you see on CNN. It's very true, you know, I come from Serbia and actually I still get questions.
Same problem, yeah.
I really get questions
Sure.
whether it's safe to travel to
go.
Belgrade. And it's like, well, the war was in '93, you know? I mean, I went to Beirut for New Year's and half of my Western friends thought I'm completely crazy. When the coup d'etat happened in Istanbul, my parents were actually living there and I was going there. People were canceling their trips and stuff, you know, but when the terrorist attacks happened in Paris, Brussels, and London in 2015, nobody was canceling their trips to those cities. So there is a bit of a problem in how the West sees the East still. So I would just like to know how you overcame these
Is this a question for someone
prejudices?
specifically or to everyone?
I can address the whole.
Yeah, sure.
So,
Yeah.
for example, when I say the Middle East is not what you see on CNN, and also the Middle East is not a country. The Middle East is a lot of countries. So, for example, when I come and talk about the Moroccan modernist movement, which was in the 60s, it's completely different to the Egyptian modernist movement, to the Iraqi modernist movement, to the Iranian modernist movement. And when someone comes up to you and says, well, tell me a bit about Middle Eastern art, well, it's like me going up and telling you, please tell me about European art. What is European art? It's a very, very rich and diverse region, and everyone had their own path and trajectory for growth. So Morocco in the 60s is a lot more minimal. Egypt in the 20s and 30s has a lot of academic and romantic art. Iraq has a lot of construction. I never know how to say this word. Constructivist art. Like everything is very, very different. So everyone has their own path and everyone has their own trajectory for growth. And if we constantly attempt to box the Middle East as one area and one region, it's counterproductive. It's really, really counterproductive, I find.
I agree. To answer your question about what challenges, but I mean, it was challenging because nobody thought there was any, contemporary art coming out from Middle East, Arab artists, Iranian artists of a certain generation. So it was, or on the one hand, I mean, the other thing was like there was expectation, like it should look a certain way, or it should have a certain message, or it should have
bullet.
Yeah, like it should, and I
calligraphy.
actually calligraphy.
Something.
Yeah, and I
Calligraphy and bullets.
consciously avoided that. Unless I thought that the artist was doing something really interesting within that. I do have an artist I work with who's a master calligrapher, but she was doing something really interesting with calligraphy. So it wasn't like I was like, no, none of that. But there was an expectation, and I think there's always like this the way that the Middle East has been viewed, or it was exotic, or it was like, sort of going back to the Orientalists and this sort of ideas of. So we had to break through a lot of that. When you said taboo, I don't think it was taboo to show Middle Eastern art. I think people were just kind of like, what do you mean? And the art world is a very white, male-dominated world that you can't deny that, but it is changing. And interestingly, in the Middle East, it's actually there's a lot of
complete opposite.
There's a lot of women in the art world that
much
like
more
myself, and people always ask me, so do you have like female artists? I'm like, yes, so many, but and again, we weren't trying to be like we're just working, but it wasn't taboo. I think people just didn't understand it. But I actually think that 2001 served as a really important moment, because suddenly everyone wanted to know what's going on in the Middle East. It's like, well, who are these people, and what do we know about them? And the artists were able to tell that story. So that, I think, I don't know if I answered your question.
What created that interest, do you think, is rather...
What created the interest in Middle East?
Well, I mean, I really think that I think the advent of art to buy on the scene actually had an enormous impact on that, for better or for worse. But I think all of a sudden, I think there was a global platform.
I think 2001 created the interest.
Yeah,
I think everyone was like,
too,
who are these people and what are they doing?
Well, I think the curiosity and animosity has probably been there for centuries, and since we went with the Crusaders, and I mean, there's a long history.
There is a fascination with the things that you don't know and the things that
unpleasant encounters, but
I mean,
but I think art to buy had a major role, played a major role, I think, in putting that on the map. It was at the same time that
with Sunny, I think it's pre-art Dubai. I think definitely.
I'm talking about the art market.
But I think not only the art. I think this fascination with the Middle East, whether it be literature, whether it be film or art, it was always like post 2001. It was like, who are these people and what are they like? Are they like us? Or are they not like us? Or
I'm not sure I agree with that 100%. I think it also depends on where you are and which city. I mean, New York is not the same as, I grew up in Germany, and I can tell you that there was a lot of knowledge of Iranian or Persian at the time history and filmmaking and everything throughout, and the whole war and the revolution had an enormous impact on business relationship within Germany. It was very, very prominent. The first empress also, who had German origins, and
That's true.
so there was a lot of connections to that people followed the royal family and all those things. I'm not sure there's a entirely true. You can also, even on the West, kind of make such assignments. Is also to answer your question of the West sees it like this or that. I think we all live in very diverse societies. I think even in Spain, you cannot say what is the Spanish art viewer. We're in Catalonia here right now, and we follow the news. We are arts people. We like the arts. That means we cannot probably have a normal conversation with 95% of the population in our own societies because they don't get us and we don't get them. I'm being a bit sarcastic, but there's so many divisions of rich and poor, city and country. Barcelona is not Madrid and not Sevilla. And all the cities are so diverse that I think the individual kind of viewpoints, or what your individual reference points are, really had an enormous impact also on where you live and what the connection is with this Middle East. So I think while you can't lump the Middle East, I'm also very, very, very strongly always advocating that you can't lump the West either, because you're from Serbia. Is that West, right? Many people in the Middle East will probably think of you as Western. But in our European context, we would think of you as Eastern somehow, right? And is Russia the West? Is Brazil the West? Are we talking about something Christian? Is it South Africa? Is that the West? Australia? What exactly do we mean when we talk about the West anyway? This is also a very silly term in my opinion.
I have a very interesting anecdote, just for a minute, from a gallery from Estonia that told me actually that the perception about them changes according to where they go.
Exactly.
So when they go to New York, they are looked at Eastern because, Estonia is still kind of in the Soviet bloc, even though they're trying very hard to get rid of that identity. When they go to Moscow Fair, they're seen as the West because they're part of the EU now. And then in Europe, they're just, East. So it depends.
If I just may add, it just kind of draws back to the UAE. I think you mentioned our Dubai a lot, but I think here we have to mention our colleagues that worked across different emirates. Like Sharjah, what Nur Al-Qasimi has done with the Biennial. I think that began in the 90s, and so there was a lot of effort, private effort, regionally, I think, to entice that curiosity as to what is happening in the Middle East. But I would like to detach from that aspect of the Middle East. I think Dubai as a city can act as a conduit for cross-regional conversation. Is it south to south? Is it north to south? Where it's geographically located, but also in terms of the kind of content that we produce, the kind of stories that artists are making, and I think the kind of efforts that all stakeholders are initiating. And these dialogues are no longer geographically limited. I think it's really about that mobility. Distance is imagined today. I think the only distance that we have is with our public. And that's probably the only thing that we need to be revisiting.
Online.
Perhaps we can ask for some more questions. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know who came first, so you can pick. You're the boss.
Thank you very much for
I
your
don't even know
talk. Yes, I wanted to ask you two questions for the next future.
Okay.
One is, what is your cooperation this year with the Universal Expo in Dubai? If you are doing synergies to promote more all your initiatives in galleries, in the Alserkal. And the other side, what are your strategy to have more international cooperations? And I ask in particular with Spain, with Barcelona, Madrid, or whatever, because also Spain is the country in Europe who has the historic cultural liaison with the Arabic countries, and I think it's quite unknown your initiative here in this country. This is my two questions. Thank you.
Oh, you're asking
To anyone specifically?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yes.
Okay.
With
Perhaps you maybe.
the first part of the question was, are we doing something with Expo? And the second part was, are we doing anything with Spain?
With Spain, yes.
I just started to work with an artist who's based here in Barcelona, who's actually here, Anwar Khalifi. So I think that's something that somehow, that's bringing me here. So I feel that, he's from here. That I think is that's what I can tell you right now. The expo, I think we're trying to do something with them. The expo is a very, I mean, it's a government project. It's a very different organization. I don't know if you have any.
So we actually
don't have much of a.
But maybe you as an institution.
Yeah, I think the institutions are speaking.
Well, I think again, as the kind of urban intervention within the city, it's important that it's our duty as a conduit that liaises between the government and, like I said, public and private sector. It's important to work with different initiatives. And I think working with the Expo, there are two aspects. We are part of their youth program, and we identified ways to participate in allowing our creative economy representatives in business in the avenue to actually produce different products and be part of it. And I think as an institution to find our ways through program, because we're not so attached to that physicality. I think, expos produce so much content, it can be overwhelming. I think our way was to create more of a pause and a way to rethink during that time. And so we will be very active in Alserkal and at the Expo, creating those connections and actually exploring mobility between the two and how programming can occur to make change. I think it's important to not hold us synonymous with built environment, but look at us as a social structure that can initiate those conversations through artistic medium and beyond. And so we are very collaborative as an institution. And we worked with many partners across the world to facilitate those connections and conversations. And always we're present for the past maybe 6 years at Venice Biennial, or by again creating some sort of experimental program that usually produces content throughout that particular initiative. So any ideas, any suggestions, any interest, we're always open.
Thank you. So there was a question here in the first row.
So my question is to everyone on the panel. You've spoken about the paucity of traditional art institutions in the Middle East, but you all have very strong connections, whether to Western museums or auction house franchises, art fairs, businesses. How does the lack of traditional local institutions affect the market in the Middle East? I run an art gallery in Ukraine, and it's part of the post-Soviet bloc where there are very strong traditional institutions, and often the private sector is in conflict with those post-Soviet museums, academies. When the Pinchuk Art Center opened in 2008, it's the privately funded gallery that brought Damien Hirst, Ai Weiwei, Anish Kapoor to Ukraine. There was a lot of resistance from the museum community as well as the gallery community to there being even, this institution. So is perhaps the lack of traditional institutions in the Middle East allowing you to kind of forge your own path? And can you comment on Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, please?
Funny question. That's two questions. The second one, I think.
Where is it?
Where is it? Yes, exactly. I think Leonardo da Vinci. I think.
There's another one.
I think we all can read the same international press. I mean, unless you guys have any inside scoops, which I don't have on the story, then I think there is not much.
I have some scoop. But
okay,
I'm
you can spill it in a minute, maybe, but
private.
It's in your home.
But like about traditional.
But I wanted to say something really important, I think, and I think we should perhaps clarify when I was saying that there is perhaps a lack of traditional institutions. I think this is also something that you need to differentiate city by city and country by country. I mean, in Lebanon, for example, you do have a much longer standing tradition of institution. You have organizations that have been around for a very long time, whether it's, the American University of Beirut, for example, that has an art gallery that's one of the oldest universities in the entire region. You have the Sotheby Museum, you have also other initiatives that are there. So you have that also in Cairo. There is a Museum of Modern Art.
I can speak about
you can talk about it in a second. I think I want to just highlight the National Gallery of Jordan. I mean, there's a lot of institutions. Absolutely. I think what happens, though, is that as history, and this is not true in the UAE, because I think that's a different, smaller populations traditionally that are not really maybe thinking of archiving in way that we are used to it in many European places.
The UAE
How
is
you
also-
collect, and UAE is a
How
very
old is
special
The
the
place.
UAE is
UAE?
only 46.
It's very
That's
yeah,
As a
very
country,
exactly.
but I think there have been, there have been people living there for a long time, but there were very small populations also. They're not
nomadic
big
tribes.
mostly, yes. So I think what I wanted to say is that in many cities and many places, what had happened, if there is a political change or political turmoil, that these institutions become either politicized or neglected, or they become part of something that artists actually end up criticizing, right? So in many cities, you have the situation that you're either with the government, but then most of contemporary artists are actually completely against, a certain establishment. So there is a clear dichotomy that you don't have something in several cities, and I think Cairo is a prime example, or other countries where you don't have a case that they are really really embracing the local art scene and continuing to do so and continuing to archive that. So it's really a city by city approach. The story of that is a little bit more complex, but it is still true that in many places you can't go and expect to go in an art museum like you can go when you go to Barcelona and you run your checklist. You have some cities where you can do it very well, and others where it's much more challenging. So
Well, on the topic of Ukraine, when I compare it to Alexandria, where I'm from, I co-support an art school which is called Mass Alexandria.
Correct.
for young emerging artists, and I co-support it with Wael Shawi, who's one of the most established Egyptian artists. He's actually represented by Listen, and him and I, like, the University of Fine Arts hates us. They think what we're doing is completely disruptive because you're not really educating the students in what they think is proper fine arts education, and they're being exposed to something completely different. So they force their students not to apply to the program, and if a student applies to the program, they make sure to make him fail. It is that you do see these hurdles. However, as Vilma, who's visited us at Mass Alexandria, you can see, like, we end up having probably some of the most interesting young avant-garde Egyptian artists coming out of these projects, because they're sort of rebelling also from the institutes, and these institutes are very governed by strict old archaic systems, and sort of you just need to keep pushing the boundaries. And I think one of the things that we are missing in Cairo is a Kunsthalle, which is independent from the government for contemporary art, which we don't have. And I think once that opens, definitely the Ministry of Culture will be saying, why are you guys doing this?
Correct.
And why are you competing with our museums? But
because they think it is contemporary somehow.
exactly, because they have their own definition of what is contemporary art, and it's actually not at all in congruence with anything related to contemporary art. So I think that's what you have to always see. And again, I can talk about Cairo and Alexandria, and we can also look at Morocco, which has a very
striving scene. Yeah.
Marrakesh has a beautiful museum called Makal, which I think they spoke about last year. So every city,
Tunisia, Tunis.
exactly, every city in the Middle East has a different trajectory, and it's also in conversation with their own governments and their own societies.
And I think, if I may add just on this, I think in the context of Dubai, even when I think of Alserkal being around for 10 years, I think at some point we were wondering whether we are becoming traditional because of that context. When we started, I think we had different gaps to fill, and now you have other institutions that emerged, and we didn't have to fill those gaps anymore. So it requires us to undergo cultural audit, to rethink who we are and what is needed, and where we want to grow in the future. And I think with that, we started allowing for more experimental commissions and work, and allowing for that critique of us by artists and multidisciplinary practitioners and researchers that we would invite for a 2-month residency program 3 times a year to come and engage with the city. I think, going back to your first question as to how you can change that, those perceptions, you can't. I think it's an attempt by creating those invitations and those conversations and inviting different minds, practitioners, and artists to produce these new forms of knowledge through research is perhaps the way that we are thinking of pursuing that going forward.
I think we have time for one last question. So whoever is really feeling very strongly or is very quick.
Very strongly. Feeling very strongly
about asking a question. Sorry, I forgot the rest of the sentence.
Hi guys.
Hello.
Sunny, you mentioned during your presentation that the third line started off representing artists in a Western way, and then you moved away from it. I was wondering if you could expand on what that means and why it happened.
Thanks, Tim. So what I meant is the model that we initially started with, or the representation model of like how you sign an artist and the things that you agree on. I took that from my experience in working in New York in galleries there, and it was different because in the Middle East so far people had not had representation. I mean, you do a show, but then so I guess that was what I was saying. Like I was like, okay, let's do it like that, where we have these artists, we sign them. We actually are representing them. It's a long view on their career, and which was faced initially and still sometimes with people were just not necessarily in agreement with the ways that they were like, what do you mean, so, and some people were actually really, they embraced it. They were like, this is great. That means that we have this long-term relationship. But yeah, I mean, that's what I meant by Western model. I should have said just a gallery, an established gallery model that I took.
And having been there in the early days, I can also tell you that it really didn't feel like a Western model when you came there. I mean, there was also these Picha Kucha nights or something. It really, I think it's fair to say, it was much more like a community center of sorts, maybe in terms of representing artists and buying and selling or structuring the program perhaps. But everything else, it felt really much more like a community art center that was filling the gap. I mean, that was the go-to place for creatives at that time. Because there really wasn't much else.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I meant by a model, the Western model, to clarify, was that we were just like, okay, so we offer representation of our artists versus just it's a space, you do a show, and then we forget about you and you move on. Because we were doing a lot more than.
Correct.
Yeah, but the space itself was definitely. I mean, it was very dynamic. We tried to do as much as we could within. Like I said, we had a film. A film series. We'd watch films like Iranian films, Arab films, and then we'd have discussions about them. Same thing with the book club and artist talks and that kind of programming that also was very educational. So there were no institutions at that time. Now the institutions are doing them. I mean, Alserkal is great. They're filling a lot of these gaps that we at the time had to do.
Great, and I just want to thank our panelists. I want to maybe just one final thought on my end, my 2 cents. And I think, we all share this passion for art, and I think art really brings people together, and we take the effort to try to find out something about artists. And I think what is very important in the sort of global political times and the discourse that we live in is that we also make the effort to actually listen to different viewpoints, visit different cities. I think we all too often have opinions about people that we don't know, about places that we have not visited, about cultures that we don't know, about things that we simply don't want to see. And I would urge everyone, if you haven't been to Dubai, come to the fair in March, check out the art scene, meet all the people. I think the people that you see here are actually very typical. May is often in Dubai. I mean, this is what Dubai really looks like. I mean, really. So I think you should come and discover for yourself and see and what you like and what you dislike. The art fair, I think, is a great moment to come. It's the last week in March this year. So come and meet us all there again. So thank you so much for coming, and hope you had a good time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.